So PANGAEA is a data publisher and information system for earth and environmental sciences and for biological and biodiversity data. It was evolving from a sediment core repository database that was created in the late 90s. It has an almost 30-year history as a data library and information system, and is one of the first repositories applying DOI names to data sets. PANGAEA is financed to one half by our two hosting institutions, the MARUM, the Center for Marine and Environmental Sciences, and the Alfred Wegener Institute Polar, the Center for Polar and Marine Sciences. And to the other half by third-party funding for providing data management expertise for national and international projects since 1997. PANGAEA offers certified quality services as a fair-ready data repository and is accredited by the World Meteorological Organization and the World Data System by ICSU, and holds the Core Trust seal that has just been renewed recently. PANGAEA holds data from a wide range of disciplines. In contrast to other repos, PANGAEA applies a thorough quality assessment and quality control by a manual curation of each data submission. These submissions are usually very heterogeneous by nature and are a consequence of a constantly and dynamically changing research environment. To give a few iconic examples, of data depositions, we host seismic profiles, a plethora of distributed individual samples, climate indicators like sea ice extent and ice shelf properties, bathymetry data, meteorological time series, data from physical and biological oceanography, C4 imagery, species abundance data and biological observations, underwater soundscape recordings, and many, many more. Speaking in terms of domains, the largest proportion of data is about the hydrosphere, followed by the biosphere and the lithosphere. In total, PANGAEA hosts around 420,000 data sets. That's more than 25 billion data points related to more than 780 projects, and growing at a rate of around 10,000 data sets per year. Now, let's have a brief look who's behind PANGAEA. PANGAEA is run by a team of data editors who are doing the actual data curation and editing work. Scientific data and project managers, usually data editors as well. A small team of experienced developers, and the management that's complemented by a coordination position. If you think like, well, that's a whole bunch of people on that picture, you are right. But this is because it includes data managers and editors of our collaboration partners. The technical infrastructure, knowledge, and operational procedures of PANGAEA, what we call the back office, are shared with these partners that established their own institutional data management and created a so-called front office. Right now, PANGAEA has this sort of agreements with the GEOMA, Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Kiel, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, the ZMT, Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen, the MPU for Chemistry in Mainz, and the ZAM, rather, let's say, the Center for Applied Space Science in Microgravity, also in Bremen. As I said earlier, PANGAEA is involved in a series of third-party funded projects, like the National German Marine Research Alliance, the DMM that I was talking about earlier, and the National Research Data Infrastructure Consortia, the NFDI for Earth and Biodiversity. And the EU projects like iAtlantic, Summer, Arctic Passion, and more. In terms of expertise, these projects add a great wealth of input and varying backgrounds to the team. Okay, in the coming 2 days, we are talking a lot about how to find and get data out of PANGAEA, but to have an idea of what to expect from the data, we thought it might be worthwhile to have at least a basic understanding about how it actually got in, and about what to do and what we do and what kind of contextual information we collect to complement the described data when it's submitted to us. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of a few elements and tools that are involved in the usual workflow of a data publication. First, we have the website as the primary point of entry. In addition to providing access to the data, it provides links to many other useful resources and services. For example, there's a primary documentation resource, the wiki, that can be found when you click on the help button. It provides a lot of backgrounds, useful submission templates, guides, and standard procedures, operating procedures, sorry. But now we focus on the big submit data button that I right now can't see very well because of the bar there. Because we want to start a data publication. We are talking about data publications right now. So this will lead us to the form that is used to gather all required information during a data submission. After it's completed, a so-called submission ticket is created in our Jira issue tracker. It's, oh, I just skipped one. It's used for the communication with the authors and the documentation of that communication and the operational progress of the submission process. It helps us a lot to organize and keep track of the many submissions that we work on contemporary. That can be around 300 and more at times. Then there's the editorial system that is only accessible to our data editors. That is the interface that helps us transform a data submission into a PANGAEA dataset and getting all the helpful contextual information or metadata tied to it. Once this so-called data ingest is done, a specific landing page for the dataset is created that is tied to a persistent identifier later, the DOI. Okay, so much for the elements involved in the data submission, but there's quite a bit more to it. Of course. The following schematic representation, a simplified publication workflow, shows the general sequence from the submission to publication and dissemination from the left to the right. Authors start the submission, wants to submit data to PANGAEA and visits the website. Earlier, he had a short question sorted out with our front desk support and had another look at our wiki to double check the submission guidelines and explanations. You may have realized that we are talking about an idealized case here, but all looks fine and set. So the author uses the submit data button and the submission form opens. In 5 steps, the required context information is entered, the data file is uploaded, an embargo period is set, and the final button for submission is pressed. This creates this ticket, data submission ticket, how we call it, in our issue tracker system. It includes all the information and data that was provided in the form. The user gets notified about that ticket per mail, and it's invited to work on it in the web browser together with the PANGAEA people. Next, the editorial board does what could be considered essentially a formal review. The board checks the submission fits the scope of PANGAEA, and if all required context details are there to make sense of the data. In particular, the abstract and the title is helpful in that regard. We also check if the geospatial and temporal reference had been provided. That is mandatory requirement, but also the sampling details, funding, and authorship information. But also data files are analyzed for obvious shortcomings like abbreviated and ambiguous variable names, missing units, and some formal don'ts like cluttered data sheets, placeholders, etc. In a few ideal cases, this doesn't take long because the data was prepared so well, but usually it takes 1 or 2, sometimes even more request and feedback cycles until all is set. So if the author is cooperating with this, otherwise data might get rejected as well. But let's assume the submission is complete and got accepted in the end. When it's due in the waiting line, it gets assigned to a data editor with a similar background, and we enter the data processing stage. In this stage, the submission ticket and previous communication is handed over to the editor that initially does another more in-depth review, including checks on the quality of data and the metadata provided, all from an expert perspective this time, and both in terms of disciplinary standards, as well as good data management practices. Usually this leads to a few feedback cycles, but also to a fruitful collaboration of the authors and editors to considerably enhance the quality of the data and the richness of its contextual information. What the editor does or is doing in this process is to sample and further enrich this contextual data and connect them to the data set. Further, one major curation effort is to standardize variables or parameters by assigning them to terms of the PANGAEA terminology catalog. The catalog includes terms and concepts from internationally endorsed vocabularies and ontologies from various disciplines. But they also harmonize units and numerical formats to support interoperability and comparability between similar studies. On a data level, the editors usually iron out some typical minor twitches in the data sheets, like data format errors and other issues. But ideally, this is not necessary. The editors use a range of tools for that purpose, including capable text editors, scripting environments like Jupyter Notebooks and RStudio, and others. Not to mention the magic wand they received during the PANGAEA initiation. Finally, data and metadata is fed into the editorial system. And by doing so, as I said earlier, the dataset landing page is created. Here's one example of such a landing page. It contains all the meta information of that dataset and is instantly publicly visible and findable. However, the status in this stage is set to dataset in review, meaning that the data access is only available to the data author and those with explicit permission by the author. Those access restrictions are in place until the data set was approved for publication and the moratorium is lifted or has ended. Usually it takes a bit of back and forth between editors and the authors until all issues have been worked out and both are satisfied. So we consider it an iterative process that ideally ends with the approval of the author for publication of that dataset. If this has been granted, the dataset is released for publication and a DOI name is requested from DataCite. Once the DOI was minted and assigned, the publication is complete. If no moratorium is in place, data is freely available for reuse. But briefly back to the dataset in review. It's important to note that the access restrictions are, of course, also applied for scripted and interactions. So if you ever encounter problems with data from PANGAEA, make sure to check the dataset status and embargo periods. Okay, we have reached the final stage of our publication workflow. The dataset is published, has its unique identifier, and is free for download and reuse. In this workshop, you're going to hear a lot about different ways to access datasets with different tools via the landing pages, with APIs, the data warehouse, etc. But before one can access data, one has to find it first. So Katrin will explain how to best do that with PANGAEA Search later this day. And I would like to conclude this part with a question, where else you can find datasets published with us other than PANGAEA itself. So datasets are, of course, referenced in related articles of peer-reviewed journals. PANGAEA exchanges metadata with publishers and metric systems to simplify cross-links and cross-linking of data and articles. But metadata records are also actively harvested by a range of data aggregators like DataCite Commons, OpenAIRE, DataOne, and AmmoNet, and by general search engines like Google, and for use in its dataset search service, for example. The third group is a whole spectrum of community and project-specific data portals. They are actively harvesting PANGAEA metadata to make them available for their projects and communities.